There is a building in Rome where 2 world wars happened around it, and it emerged from both, completely untouched. Not because it was lucky, not because it was hidden. It sits in the middle of one of the most bombed cities in Europe, in plain sight, on a hill you can see from almost anywhere in Rome. It wasn't untouched because it was protected by an army. The entire military force defending this place consisted of, at its peak, roughly 100 men, carrying halberds, decorative pole weapons that hadn't been used in actual combat since the 1500s. And yet both Nazi Germany and the Allied forces, the 2 most powerful military machines in human history, each fighting a war of total annihilation, both decided independently that this building was off limits. Why? Because what happened inside those walls was more valuable than anything a bomb could destroy. This is the story of the Vatican during World War II, and it is not the story you think it is.
Most people know the broad outlines. The Vatican stayed neutral. The Pope said very little. There are debates about whether he should have said more. That story is real, and we will get to it. But underneath that official story, the story of diplomatic silence and careful neutrality, there was something else happening entirely. Inside the Vatican, inside its convents and monasteries and diplomatic pouches and confession booths, there was a functioning intelligence network. Information moved through the Catholic Church the way electricity moves through wire, invisibly, quickly, across borders that were otherwise completely sealed. Generals on both sides knew it. Spy masters knew it. The OSS, the precursor to the CIA, had a specific Vatican desk. So did British intelligence. So, for a while, did the Abwehr, German military intelligence. They weren't spying on the Vatican. They were trying to spy through it.
And the Vatican, officially neutral, officially above the fray, was letting them, or perhaps more accurately, it was making choices about who to let in, what information to pass, and what to keep. That is a very different thing than neutrality. Let me take you back to 1939, because to understand what the Vatican became during the war, you first have to understand what it was before. On February 11th, 1929, Benito Mussolini and Cardinal Pietro Gasparri signed a document called the Lateran Treaty, and it created something genuinely strange in international law. The Vatican, a 44-hectare plot of land inside Rome, roughly the size of a golf course, became a sovereign nation-state. This mattered enormously. It meant the Pope was no longer just a religious leader. He was a head of state. He could send and receive ambassadors. He had diplomatic relations recognized under international law. He could negotiate treaties. He had the full toolkit of statecraft, if not the military power to back it up. By 1939, the Vatican had diplomatic representatives in 38 countries. More importantly, the Catholic Church had parishes, convents, monasteries, schools, and hospitals in virtually every country on Earth, including every country about to be swallowed by war. Think about what that means as an information network. A priest in Warsaw can write a letter to Rome. A nun in Lyon can pass a message to a bishop. A bishop in Berlin has lunch with a Nazi official and learns something. That information can move through canonical channels, letters, diplomatic pouches, the movement of clergy, across borders that are otherwise hermetically sealed. Normal governments couldn't do this. The British embassy in Berlin closed in September 1939. The American embassy in Rome became useless after December 1941. Every conventional information pipeline between the Allied nations and the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe was cut. The Vatican's pipeline never closed. This wasn't a conspiracy. It wasn't planned as an intelligence network. It was simply the structure of the Catholic Church, which had been building a transnational organizational infrastructure for 1900 years, suddenly finding itself in the middle of the most information-starved conflict in history. Nature abhors a vacuum. So does a war. The man at the center of all this was a German-speaking Vatican diplomat who had been trained his entire career for exactly this kind of crisis, and who would spend the rest of his life being accused of not doing enough with the position fate had given him. His name was Eugenio Pacelli, and on March 2nd, 1939, 6 months before the war began, he became Pope Pius XII. To understand Pius XII, you have to understand where he came from. He was not a theologian who stumbled into politics. He was a diplomat first and a theologian second. He had served as the Vatican's apostolic nuncio in Munich and then in Berlin during the 1920s, which means he had spent years watching the slow, horrifying rise of the Nazi movement up close. He watched Hitler give speeches. He watched the boycotts of Jewish businesses in 1933. He watched Kristallnacht in 1938. He was not naive. He was not uninformed. Informed people in Europe about what was happening inside Germany. He spoke German fluently. He had friends in Germany. He had sources in Germany. And when he became Pope, those networks didn't disappear. They became his. The question that historians have fought over for 80 years is not whether Pius XII knew. The question is what he chose to do with what he knew. But before we get to that, I want to show you what the network actually looked like, because most accounts of the Vatican during World War II focus on the Pope, and the Pope is important, but the Pope is not the whole story. The network had nodes, real people in real places making real decisions. Let me introduce you to 3 of them. The first is a man named Luigi Maglione. He was the Vatican's Secretary of State, roughly equivalent to a foreign minister, from 1939 until his death in 1944. His office received reports from papal nuncios across Europe. When a bishop in Slovakia wrote to Rome about what was happening to Slovak Jews in 1942, that letter went to Maglione's office. When a German Jesuit slipped information about Wehrmacht troop movements to a Vatican contact, it eventually found its way to Maglione. He was, in intelligence terms, a collector. His job was to receive information and decide what reached the Pope. The second node is a German-born bishop named Alois Hudel, and this one is more complicated. Hudel was an Austrian theologian living in Rome who in 1937 wrote a book that tried to reconcile Catholicism and National Socialism. The Vatican quietly distanced itself from the book, but Hudel himself stayed in Rome, stayed connected, and during the war found himself acting as a bridge between the Vatican and German officials in ways that would later prove deeply troubling. After the war, it emerged that Hudel had helped facilitate the escape of Nazi war criminals through what became known as the Ratlines, routes through Italy and then on to Argentina or other South American nations. He helped Franz Stangl, the commandant of Treblinka, escape. He helped Alois Brunner, one of the key organizers of the deportation of European Jews, get out of Europe. He did this using Vatican connections, Vatican paperwork, and the goodwill the Church had built with various border officials. He was, in intelligence terms, an operator, someone who used the network for his own ends that had nothing to do with anything the Church would sanction if it thought carefully about what he was doing. But then there is the third node, and this one is different from both of them. In the autumn of 1943, the German military occupied Rome. For 3 years, the war had been something that happened elsewhere. Now it was on Rome's doorstep, in its streets, in its markets, and its railway stations. The Gestapo set up offices. Jews in Rome, many of whom had lived there for generations. Rome's Jewish community is one of the oldest in the world, predating Christianity, were suddenly in mortal danger. On October 16, 1943, SS troops carried out a roundup of Roman Jews. It began before dawn. In a single morning, more than 1,200 people were taken from their homes. Within weeks, most of them were dead at Auschwitz. The Vatican was 200 meters away. Into this situation stepped a tall, large-framed Irish priest with a booming laugh and a gift for bending rules without quite breaking them. His name was Hugh O'Flaherty, and he was a senior official in the Holy Office, the Vatican department that handled matters of church doctrine. O'Flaherty had been in Rome since 1938. He spoke Italian, German, and French. He loved golf, which gave him an excuse to circulate throughout Roman society. He had contacts everywhere: aristocrats, diplomats, black marketeers, priests, nuns, Swiss guards. When the German occupation began, O'Flaherty did something that required genuine courage, or perhaps a specific kind of Irish stubbornness that functions like courage. He started hiding people. Allied soldiers who had escaped from prisoner of war camps, Jewish families from the Roman Roundup, Italian resistance fighters, political opponents of the Nazi regime. He hid them in convents, in monasteries, in apartments belonging to Roman aristocrats who were willing to take the risk, in the basements of the Pontifical Irish College. At its peak, O'Flaherty's network, later called the Rome Escape Line, was sheltering somewhere between 4,000 and 6,500 people. The Gestapo knew he was doing it. They knew his name, his face, his daily routine. Their chief in Rome, a lieutenant colonel named Herbert Kappler, was determined to arrest him. But O'Flaherty was too smart for a direct confrontation, and he had one advantage that Kappler couldn't easily overcome. Vatican territory was sovereign soil. The Germans had agreed to respect it. If O'Flaherty stayed inside the Vatican, Kappler couldn't touch him.
So Kappler did the next best thing. He had a white chalk line drawn on the pavement at the entrance to St. Peter's Square, the precise boundary of Vatican territory. He told his men, if O'Flaherty crosses that line, arrest him immediately. O'Flaherty never crossed it. Instead, he became a ghost. He would appear at the top of the steps leading to St. Peter's Basilica, technically still on Vatican soil, and conduct meetings there. He would disguise himself as a nun, as a priest from a different order, as a member of the Swiss Guard. He would slip messages through Vatican channels that the Gestapo couldn't intercept without violating the Vatican's diplomatic status. It was, in purely operational terms, one of the most effective one-man intelligence and resistance operations of the entire war.
And almost nobody outside Italy knew it was happening. O'Flaherty kept no records, gave no interviews, and spent the post-war years quietly declining the many honors pressed upon him. When pressed, he would say he had only done what any priest would do. That was, charitably, not quite true. But here's what I want you to hold on to about O'Flaherty, because it matters for what comes next. O'Flaherty was operating inside the Vatican's infrastructure. He was using Vatican buildings, Vatican contacts, Vatican diplomatic cover. He was using the network. But was the Vatican, was Pius XII, directing him, authorizing him, even aware of exactly what he was doing? That question does not have a clean answer, and it points toward the deepest mystery at the center of this whole story. Here is something that tends to get lost in the debates about Pius XII's moral choices. Before we ask what the Vatican did with its information, we should ask, how much information did it actually have? The answer, as the archives have slowly revealed, is a great deal. The Vatican's diplomatic network was receiving reports from across occupied Europe throughout the war. Some of these came from nuncios, the Vatican's ambassadors, who were present in countries under German occupation. Some came from bishops and cardinals, passing information through canonical correspondence, which was treated as private mail and harder for intelligence services to intercept. Some came from ordinary priests reporting what they were seeing in their parishes. By 1942, and this is where the historical evidence is now quite clear, the Vatican had received credible information that Jews were being killed in vast numbers in Eastern Europe. Not rumors, documented reports from credible sources. A Slovak bishop named Jan Wojtaszek sent reports about the deportation of Slovak Jews beginning in 1942. The Polish government in exile, operating from London, sent the Vatican detailed information about what was happening in German-occupied Poland. A Vatican nuncio in Switzerland was receiving testimony from refugees who had escaped or fled from the occupied territories. In August 1942, the Archbishop of Lwów sent a letter to the Vatican describing what we now know was the Holocaust in extraordinary detail. He named specific places, he described methods, he estimated numbers. The Vatican received this letter, so what did they do with it? This is where the story gets genuinely difficult, and where I want to slow down, because the easy answer, that Pius XII was a coward or a collaborator, is not actually what the evidence shows. But neither is the defense, that he was secretly working against the Nazis and had no choice but to stay silent. The truth is more complicated and less satisfying than either version. Let's start with what Pius XII actually did. He was not passive. He issued an encyclical called Summi Pontificatus in October 1939, within weeks of the war's start, that implicitly condemned racism and the subjugation of weaker nations. It was vague enough that the Allies dropped copies of it over Germany as anti-Nazi propaganda. He used Vatican radio, which broadcast across Europe throughout the war, to condemn violence against civilians, again in terms that were deliberate enough to be understood, but not explicit enough to give Germany a specific cause to retaliate. He authorized the hiding of thousands of Jews in Roman religious institutions. Some estimates put the number of Jews sheltered in Catholic monasteries and convents across Italy at 4,000 to 7,000. Some historians put it higher. He kept diplomatic relations open with Germany, in part because he believed, and there is evidence to support this belief, that a public denunciation would trigger immediate retaliation against Catholics in occupied territories and might accelerate violence against Jews rather than slow it. This was not an unreasonable calculation. When the Bishop of Münster, a German Catholic leader named Clemens August Graf von Galen, publicly denounced the Nazi eugenicics program in 1941, preaching 3 famous sermons that were widely distributed. The program slowed and eventually stopped, at least officially. Von Galen's courage worked. Pius XII knew about those sermons. He was watching, and yet he did not follow the example. The argument his defenders make is that von Galen was German, protected to some degree by his nationality, operating at a moment when Hitler still needed German Catholics on his side. Pius XII, a public denunciation from the seat of global Catholicism, would have triggered something different, perhaps something catastrophic. The argument his critics make is that by the time it mattered most, in 1942, when the extermination camps were operating at full capacity, a papal denunciation might have been the one thing with enough moral weight to force the German Catholic population to confront what was being done in their name, and the Pope chose silence. Both arguments are sincere, and neither one is definitively provable. But there is a third layer to this story that both arguments tend to ignore, because the Vatican wasn't just receiving information. It was not the famous July 20, 1944 plot. This was earlier, more fragile, more desperate. The plotters were senior military men who had concluded that Hitler was going to lead Germany into a catastrophic war and needed to be stopped before he did. They were willing to act, but they needed something first. They needed assurance from the British government that if they succeeded, if they managed to remove Hitler, Britain would negotiate a peace with whatever German government replaced him, rather than using the chaos to invade and destroy what remained of Germany. The problem was obvious. These were German generals. They couldn't walk into the British embassy. They couldn't send a telegram. They were operating inside the most surveilled state in Europe, attempting to commit treason, and they needed to make contact with the enemy government without anyone finding out. Where do you find a channel like that? You find it in the Vatican. A German lawyer and intelligence officer named Josef Müller, nicknamed Joey Ox for his physical size and stubbornness, approached the Vatican in late 1939 with an extraordinary request. He wanted the Vatican to act as an intermediary between the German resistance and the British government. Müller had Vatican contacts. He was a devout Catholic, and he knew Father Robert Leiber, a German Jesuit who was the personal secretary and in many ways the personal confidant of Pius XII himself. Through Leiber, Müller's request reached the Pope, and Pius XII agreed to help. He authorized the Vatican to pass communications between the German resistance and the British government through the office of the British envoy to the Holy See, a man named Darcy Osborne. The communications went back and forth through 1940, negotiating the terms under which Britain would deal with a post-Hitler Germany. They are now called, in the historical record, the Vatican Exchanges. The operation ultimately failed. The coup against Hitler didn't happen when planned. The moment passed. Müller was eventually arrested by the Gestapo in 1943 on other charges and survived the war only because his case was still being processed when the Reich collapsed.
But the Vatican exchanges reveal something crucial about how Pius XII actually operated. He was not passive. He was not naive. He was conducting genuine, operational intelligence work, passing sensitive communications between belligerent governments through the one channel that both sides would trust and respect.
He did this in secret, because if it had become known, it would have destroyed the Vatican's neutrality, endangered Müller and the German resistance, and potentially given Hitler a pretext to occupy the Vatican itself, something Hitler had apparently discussed. This is the context in which all the other choices Pius XII made need to be understood. He was not a man who believed that moral silence was the appropriate response to evil. He was a man who had decided, very deliberately, that the most effective thing the Vatican could do was act covertly rather than publicly, to use its position as a trusted neutral to move information, facilitate contact, and protect people where it could, rather than to make declarations that would feel morally satisfying, but might accomplish nothing except hardening the enemy's resolve. Whether that calculation was right is a different question. It's the question historians are still fighting about. But it's important to understand that it was a calculation, not an abdication.
Here is a detail that doesn't appear in most popular accounts of the Vatican during World War II. While Joseph Müller was using Vatican channels to pass messages to the British government on behalf of the German resistance, the German intelligence service, the Abwehr, was also using the Vatican as an intelligence asset, not against the Vatican, not to spy on Pius XII, but because they recognized the same thing the Allies recognized. The Vatican was the one organization with access to places no one else could reach. The Abwehr had an officer, a man named Wilhelm Canaris, who ran German military intelligence and who was simultaneously, in one of the strangest double lives of the entire war, working against Hitler. Canaris was a genuine resistor. He used the Abwehr's resources to protect Jews, to warn resistance networks, to sabotage Nazi operations from the inside. He also had Vatican contacts.
The Vatican, knowingly or not, was serving both sides simultaneously. Information flowed into it from Allied sources. Information flowed into it from German sources, and then filtered through the judgment of a handful of men in positions of trust, men like Maglione, like Leiber, like the Pope himself. It was decided what to do with each piece. This is not how most people understand neutrality. Most of us think of neutrality as simply not taking sides, staying out of it. But what the Vatican was doing was more complicated, and arguably more powerful than that. It was positioning itself as the indispensable node in a network that neither side could build on its own. Both sides needed it. Both sides were therefore willing to protect it, to maintain their recognition of its sovereignty, to ensure that the channel remained open. It was the original back channel. The British envoy Darcy Osborne, operating from the Vatican throughout the war, had a staff of one, a single manservant named John May, who turned out to be resourceful enough to run his own small intelligence operation, bribing Italian and German officials for information and passing it to Osborne, who passed it to London. The American envoy, Myron Taylor, sent to the Vatican by Franklin Roosevelt with the personal rank of ambassador in December 1939, was there specifically because Roosevelt understood the intelligence value of what the Vatican represented. Taylor was not a diplomat by training. He was the former chairman of U.S. Steel. Roosevelt sent him because he was a man who understood how to make deals, how to build relationships, and how to get information. By 1942, both men were regularly passing information from Vatican sources back to their governments that could not have been obtained by any other means. None of this was publicly acknowledged. None of it was officially sanctioned by the Vatican as intelligence work. It was all wrapped in the language of pastoral concern, diplomatic consultation, the exchange of views between heads of state. But the information was real, and it was operationally useful. The Vatican was, by any honest assessment, the most effective intelligence hub in Europe during World War II. It just declined to call itself that. I want to come back to Rome, October 16th, 1943.
The day the SS came for the Jews of Rome. There is a detail about that day that I find impossible to look away from, because it makes the question of what Pius XII knew and when not hypothetical, it makes it concrete.
Vatican City is less than 1 mile from the former Roman ghetto. You can walk it in 15 minutes. The SS operation began at 5:30 in the morning and lasted until mid-afternoon. 1,259 people were arrested, loaded onto trucks, and taken to the Italian Military College near the Tiber, less than half a mile from the Vatican walls, to await deportation. The Pope received word of what was happening that same morning. What did he do? He authorized a message to the German ambassador to the Holy See, Ernst von Weizsäcker, expressing concern and requesting that the German authorities exercise restraint. The message was diplomatically worded. It was not a denunciation. It was not public. Von Weizsäcker, who was himself no Nazi enthusiast and was trying to minimize Nazi crimes rather than commit them, sent a telegram to Berlin describing the Vatican's concern. He suggested that the operation in Rome was an unnecessary provocation that was causing diplomatic difficulties, and hinted that a public reaction from the Pope could create problems for the German presence in Italy. On October 19th, 3 days after the Roundup, the deportations from Rome temporarily paused. Were the deportations paused because of Vatican pressure, or because the initial operation was complete and the Nazis were regrouping, or because of logistical factors entirely unrelated to the Vatican? Historians disagree. The documentary record is ambiguous enough to support multiple interpretations. What we know is this. Of the 1,259 Romans arrested on October 16th, 1,023 were murdered at Auschwitz within days of arriving. The vast majority were killed in the gas chambers within hours of getting off the train. 16 survived the war.
We know that O'Flaherty and his network continued hiding people in Rome throughout the occupation, ultimately saving thousands. We know that Roman convents, monasteries, and churches sheltered thousands more, with, at minimum, the tacit knowledge of Vatican officials. We know that Pius XII, despite pressure from multiple governments and religious leaders, never issued a formal public denunciation of the Nazi genocide. And we know that in December 1942, when the Allied governments issued a joint declaration publicly naming and condemning the systematic murder of European Jews, the Vatican declined to add its voice. This is the controversy, not a simple one, not one where the bad guy is obvious. A genuine moral tragedy, in the original sense of the word, a situation where the choices available were all, in different ways, terrible, and where the people making them were not monsters, but flawed human beings trying to navigate an incomprehensible catastrophe with imperfect information and enormous competing obligations.
For decades, the most important evidence in this debate was locked away. The Vatican's secret archives, since 2019 officially renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archives because secret turned out to be a PR problem, contain millions of documents spanning centuries of church history. For the period covering the wartime papacy of Pius XII, those documents were not available to scholars. Researchers could see what the Vatican chose to publish, a 12-volume collection called Actes et Documents du Saint-Siège relatifs à la Seconde Guerre mondiale, released between 1965 and 1981. But they could not independently verify whether those selections were representative or whether important documents had been omitted. The arguments about Pius XII were happening in partial darkness. In March 2020, Pope Francis opened the archives for the pontificate of Pius XII to scholarly examination for the first time. Researchers from around the world flew to Rome to begin going through the documents. What they found was not a simple exoneration and not a simple condemnation. Some findings supported the defenders of Pius XII. There was more documentary evidence of private Vatican interventions on behalf of Jews than had previously been known. Internal documents showed that Vatican officials were receiving reports of mass murder earlier than some critics had assumed, and that some response, even if not public, was made. Some findings were more troubling. There were documents showing awareness of specific deportations without evidence of corresponding action. There were communications that suggested Vatican officials were more concerned with the fate of baptized Jews, Catholics of Jewish descent, than with the broader Jewish population. There was evidence of the kind of distinction-making that, however understandable in the context of the Church's own institutional logic, looks morally inadequate against the scale of what was happening.
One document drew particular attention. It was a report from the Vatican's ambassador in Slovakia, dated March 1942, describing in detailed terms the deportation of Slovak Jews, and explicitly noting that the deportees were being sent not to labor camps, but to their deaths. This report had reached the Vatican's Secretary of State. The question of what was done with that information remains contested. But here is what the archives did accomplish, regardless of how the historical debate ultimately settles. It moved the conversation from speculation to evidence. Scholars who believe Pius XII did the best he could now have documents to point to. Scholars who believe he failed morally also have documents to point to. The argument will continue, but it will be grounded in the actual record rather than in what each side imagines the record might contain. That is progress, even if it feels slow.
After the war ended, the network that had served as an intelligence hub and a rescue operation became something else. It became an escape route. The Ratlines, the networks through which Nazi war criminals fled Europe to Argentina, Brazil, Syria, and other countries, are one of the most uncomfortable chapters in the post-war history of the Catholic Church. And they are uncomfortable precisely because they used the same infrastructure that O'Flaherty used to save 6,000 people. The same network, opposite purpose. Bishop Alois Hudel, whom I mentioned earlier, was central to this. He had the Vatican connections, the access to travel documents, the relationships with Italian border officials that made it possible to move people whose identities needed to be obscured.
The scale of the Ratlines is disputed. The most credible estimates suggest that several hundred major war criminals used Vatican-connected networks to escape justice. The numbers are hard to pin down because the operations were deliberately hidden, and because the organizations involved, including the International Committee of the Red Cross, which issued travel documents to people who couldn't use their real identities, have never been fully transparent about their role. What is not disputed is that Franz Stangl, who commanded Treblinka and supervised the murder of approximately 900,000 people, escaped to Brazil via Rome, with documentation provided in part through Hudel's connections, that he lived there, openly, until a journalist tracked him down in 1967, that he was extradited, tried, and convicted, that he died in prison in 1971. What is not disputed is that Alois Brunner, who organized deportations from France, Greece, and Slovakia, and who was responsible for approximately 100,000 deaths, escaped to Syria via a similar route, and lived there until at least 2001, perhaps longer.
The Vatican has never formally acknowledged its institutional role in the Ratlines. Individual bishops and priests have been identified as participants, but the Church's official position has been that these were individuals acting outside their authority, not authorized operations. That position is difficult to maintain in its entirety, given what the documentary record shows, but it also may be partially true. The Ratlines were not a single coordinated Vatican program. They were the exploitation of Vatican infrastructure by individuals who had their own motives, operating in the chaotic aftermath of a war that had destroyed the normal functioning of European institutions. That is a meaningful distinction. It does not fully absolve the institution, but it does complicate the narrative. Hugh O'Flaherty lived until 1963. After the war, he returned to Ireland, worked quietly as a church official, and refused to discuss his wartime activities in detail. When the 1983 film The Scarlet and the Black dramatized his story, with Gregory Peck playing O'Flaherty, he had already been dead for 20 years.
Herbert Kappler, the Gestapo chief who had drawn the chalk line, was convicted of war crimes in 1947 and sentenced to life imprisonment. He was held in an Italian military hospital in Rome. In 1977, suffering from terminal cancer, he escaped. He was smuggled out of the hospital in a large suitcase by his wife. He made it to West Germany, where he died the following year. Before his death, Kappler converted to Catholicism. His conversion was administered by Hugh O'Flaherty. I keep coming back to this fact. I'm not sure I know what to do with it, except to say that it is the kind of ending that real history produces and fiction could not invent. The spy and the spymaster, the man who drew the line
and the man who refused to cross it, ending in a hospital room with a priest and a prisoner, and something that passed between them that the historical record doesn't capture.
The Vatican's wartime intelligence network did not have a single purpose. It was used to hide Jews and to help Nazis escape. It was used to negotiate resistance plots and to pass information to both sides. It was used by heroes and by people who did terrible things, and by people who were simply trying to do their jobs in an impossible situation. This is not unusual. This is what institutions do in wartime. They contain multitudes. They serve different people for different purposes. They accumulate power and then have to decide, moment by moment, how to use it. What makes the Vatican's story particular, what makes it different from the story of, say, a neutral government like Switzerland or Sweden, is the moral weight that the institution claimed for itself. The Pope was not simply a head of state. He was, in the theology of the Catholic Church, the vicar of Christ on earth, the earthly representative of a God whose fundamental nature is love, and whose followers were called to love their neighbors as themselves. When the Vatican made calculations, when it chose covert action over public denunciation, when it decided that diplomatic effectiveness required silence, when it allowed its infrastructure to be used in ways that it didn't fully control, it was making those calculations in the name of that theology, in the name of that God. That is a heavier burden than any neutral government carries. Whether the Vatican carried it adequately is, as I've said, a question that historians will argue about for a long time. The archives are now open. More documents will be studied. More evidence will surface. But I think the more interesting question, and this is where I'll leave you, is what it means for an institution to claim moral authority at exactly the moment when moral clarity is most demanded. What does it mean to be the moral center of the world when the world is at its most immoral? The Vatican's answer, in practice, was, it means you have to survive. It means you have to stay in the game. It means you have to protect your position, because without your position, you have no leverage at all. That is a reasonable argument. It is the argument every institution makes when it finds itself in an impossible situation. But there is a cost to that reasoning. When the institution that claims to speak for universal human dignity chooses institutional survival over prophetic witness, something is lost, not just for the people who needed that witness, but for the institution itself. Pius XII was beatified by Pope John Paul II in 1990. That process moved him towards sainthood, a declaration that he had lived a life of heroic virtue. His full canonization remains on hold, pending further study. The debate about whether he was a hero, a coward, or something in between continues. And perhaps that is as it should be, because the deepest questions about what we owe each other in extremity, about what institutions are for, and what they are permitted to protect, don't have tidy endings. They just have archives, slowly opening, document by document, asking us to look. There is a reason the Vatican intelligence story keeps coming back. It's not because it's a great spy thriller, though it is that. It's not because the characters are fascinating, though they are. It keeps coming back because the central question it asks is one we haven't stopped asking. What should a powerful institution do when it knows something terrible is happening?
Should it speak loudly and risk losing the position that gives it influence? Should it act quietly and preserve its ability to help, even if that help is limited? Should it use its network to rescue individuals while declining to challenge the system that is killing them? These questions did not end in 1945. Every large institution, governments, corporations, churches, international organizations, faces versions of this dilemma. Every powerful entity that has information about harm, that has access that others lack, that has to decide how to use that access, faces a version of what Pius XII faced. Most of the time, they don't face it with the same stakes. Most of the time, the consequences of their choices don't include the deaths of millions of people, but the structure of the choice is the same.
And that is why a story about an Irish priest hiding behind a chalk line and a German lawyer carrying messages between enemies through the back doors of a 44-hectare city-state, and a pope reading reports about mass murder and deciding every day what to do about them, that story is not just history, it's a mirror. If you learned something from this video that you didn't know before, consider sharing it with someone. And if you want to go deeper, Mark Riebling's book, Church of Spies, is the best single-volume treatment of the Vatican's wartime intelligence operations. It reads like a thriller and holds up as scholarship. The archives are still being studied. The story isn't finished yet.